Euranet Plus Panorama is a weekly review of European news broadcast by our network of EU radio stations.
Hi there. In this week's Panorama, in Brussels, Mario Draghi hopes his report will give the EU the impetus it needs to re-enter the global economic race. And in Eastern Europe, alarm bells are ringing over Russian drones. With European competitiveness a cornerstone of her Commission's agenda, a year ago, Ursula von der Leyen asked the former head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, to make an assessment of the situation. Getting Europe back into the driving seat will be no mean feat, so it seems apt that the Commission chief has turned to Super Mario, as he is affectionately known in some quarters, to find a way forward. Draghi's long-awaited 400-page report on how to boost the global competitiveness of European industry was unveiled this week. It proposes concrete actions to be taken in a range of areas to ensure more investment, more innovation, and more resilience. At Monday's press conference, the leading economist issued a stark warning, says Luxembourg's 100.7. If action isn't taken, the European economy could die a slow, painful death. There is, he said, a wide gap between the Union's GDP and that of the US, principally due to a lack of timely investment in high-tech sectors. RTBF reports.
We look at the US economy and we see that most of the productivity is concentrated in the high-tech sector. So we did this experiment. We took the high-tech sector out of the US economy, and we asked the question, how are the two continents comparable? How's productivity now? Well, as a matter of fact, in the European Union, productivity has been slightly better than what it was in the United States, if you take the high-tech sector out.
But what does this mean in terms of cold, hard cash? Draghi's report suggests Brussels needs to find an additional €800 billion a year to accelerate the bloc's green and digital transitions, boost its defence, and give China and the US a run for their money. The report backs the idea of a capital markets and banking union, and when it comes to strategic investments, including in defence, it proposes that the EU should use joint financing initiatives. In a comment shared by AMS, Draghi also suggests that existing funds must be used in a more efficient and targeted manner.
The EU budget also tends to be, and this is one other prescription we have in the report, it's not focused, it's highly fragmented. The risk that all this money goes into different channels is high. So one thing that is actually advocated here is a reform of the EU budget to make it more focused.
In his view, for example, the Cohesion Fund, which takes up a big portion of the bloc's budget, should be channelled into digitalisation, transport, education and connectivity. University of Ljubljana economist Mojmir Mrak tells RTV Slovenia that the report covers well-trodden ground, but that it falls short in not identifying a clear process for achieving its end goals.
The three basic objectives it sets out are things that we essentially already know. It is obvious that we have a problem in the EU, namely how to actually do what we know needs to be done. And there are two key issues here. One is how to finance it, and the second, which has not been discussed in the paper, is the decision-making process. Herein, I think, lies the key problem, and therefore the reactions to this report are likely to be mixed.
Perhaps there are a few things that Brussels could actually do less of, legislating, for instance. The former ECB chief's observation that some 13,000 legislative texts have been produced at European level over the last 5 years, as opposed to 3,000 pieces of legislation and 2,000 resolutions in the US, is shared by RTBF.
So with this legislation that we've given ourselves, we are actually self-defeating. We are killing our companies.
Italian law professor Claudio Martinelli underlined this point in an interview with Milan's Radio 24 on Thursday.
Viene addirittura fatto un calcolo nel report.
A calculation is even made in the report that it takes 19 months to produce a legislative decision from when the Commission proposes it to when it is enacted. Here, Draghi tells us, no, given today's international competition, this is not possible in terms of time, and it is not possible in terms of overcomplicating the rules.
The message that comes across loud and clear in this report is that there is a need for significant reform at the heart of the EU. It's not enough simply to bring in extra money.
Economia, politica e diritto sono intrecciati.
Economics, politics and law have always been intertwined in the construction of an entity such as the European Union. From this point of view, Draghi is following paths that have always been followed in the process of European integration. Here he underlines how the need for revisions, major reforms of an institutional nature, has a direct impact on the Union's economic capacity in the face of international competition.
Dell'Unione dentro la competizione internazionale.
Yet this message is tempered with realism, adds Professor Martinelli.
È vero che lui preconizza.
It is true that he wants to go further in integrating, but he is very realistic in this regard. I'd like to stress this point. It's not as if he's saying, watch out, either we can change the treaties within a year or we fail completely. No, he is behaving responsibly and saying, I am well aware that, for a number of political reasons, this will not happen immediately. So let's start the reforms with the treaties as they are.
The Commission has already promised to use the Draghi report as part of its programme for the next legislature. It will be examined at the informal European Council to be held in Budapest at the beginning of November. Further east in Europe, there has been much focus this week on a series of Russian drones that have ended up on EU territory. The Russian army drone equipped with explosives that crashed in Latvia on Saturday the 7th of September has unleashed an outpouring of public criticism towards the Latvian Army and Ministry of Defence, more than anything for not shooting down the drone. Māris Anžans, director of the Centre for Geopolitical Studies, a think tank in Riga, points out in an interview with Latvia's radio that such incidents have also occurred in other member states, including ones with much greater military capabilities than Latvia.
I don't think that this incident should be exaggerated in the wider geographical context, because these things do happen. At least one similar drone fell in Poland and Romania during the same period, so we should not be overly dramatic. Poland has even had crazier cases. Poland is, of course, a military giant, but Latvia is a dwarf in military terms. It is clear that Latvia is weaker in this way, that we don't have such powerful armed forces. And if even Poland, which is militarily one of the strongest countries in Europe, is unable to intercept all drones and missiles, it is not surprising that Latvia cannot do so.
In Romania, MPs have this week discussed the need for legal clarification on action that can be taken against drones. A spokesperson from the Romanian Defence Ministry, General Constantin Spinu, explains the status quo to Radio Romania.
The legislation we operate with dates from 2001. We have very clear rules on intervening against manned aircraft. In the case of drones, for the time being, we can take action only in the case of an intentional attack. In other words, an act that is seen as hostile toward Romania or NATO.
What legally constitutes legitimate self-defence seems to be up for debate. But the general consensus seems to be that it's fair game for EU and NATO member states to shoot down missiles that enter their national airspace. But can we take this one step further and shoot down a missile before it crosses our border? In an interview with the Financial Times, Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski says that this should be possible. The former head of Poland's National Security Bureau, Roman Polko, can't help but agree. He's speaking to Polski radio.
This can be done, and it is good that these words are spoken by a foreign minister who is aware that this is his job. This is probably the goal he will set himself, to convince our NATO partners to give the go-ahead so that all NATO members, not just Poland, can shoot down missiles heading for NATO territory. missiles heading from Ukraine, because it is difficult to react only when an object crosses the Polish border. The absurdity of this situation is underlined by the fact that President Zelensky has no objections. He has even encouraged it.
Lithuanian Renew Europe MEP Petras Auštrevičius stresses that the EU could also have a role to play here. Žinių radijas reports.
Šiuo atveju ir NATO, ir Europos Sąjunga yra tie natūralūs įrankiai, kuriais mes arba sakykime.
In this case, NATO and the EU are natural tools we can use. Both Romania and Latvia should seriously consider reaching out to the EU institutions. Let me remind you that Article 222 of the EU Treaty includes a solidarity clause which applies in the event that one or more member states are faced with a terrorist threat, regardless of its origin. I would also like to remind you that this provision was first invoked and initiated by France after the terrorist attack on the Charlie Hebdo magazine and other shootings in Paris, which posed a significant threat. At that time, France appealed to Brussels, to the EU institutions, requesting support. On the basis of this solidarity clause, support was provided. The threat level was raised and other measures were initiated.
Meanwhile, Estonian security expert Rainer Saks tells Kuku Radio that it's one thing to agree on the rules and wider principles of solidarity, but most NATO, and therefore EU, countries are not even physically capable of taking down these drones.
Ukraine is the only country that has been systematically repelling these drones, and it has been doing so for a year now. No other country has developed this capability. We are also seeing in Russia that drones operating in the same way cannot be taken down by Russian air defense. There is nothing to do here. There is such a capability gap. I don't think that NATO countries can go on tolerating this much longer. One option is to use the tools that Ukraine has already created, or they can probably be purchased. But Ukraine uses them under martial law, and it is a slightly different situation if you're not at war.
But saying this, Saks plays down these latest incidents.
The other side of the coin is that, according to the information currently at our disposal, there is no reason to believe that Russia is deliberately engaging in this activity. These incidents have arisen for some technical reason or other, which even Russia cannot control. But it's dangerous nonetheless. It could escalate into a major military conflict.
We'll sign off there. Come back again next week for another look at the news from a Euranet Plus perspective.